Is Agile dead? Let's explore that question by looking at the book Agile 2, The Next Iteration of Agile. There are a few key deficiencies in Agile that have been around for a long time. The first is that the Agile community avoids the question of leadership, which is really critical to scaling, and one of the reasons that Agile methods do not scale well, they start to fall apart. Agile authors largely ignored the role of data. Agile has not resonated with the DevOps community. Agile and Scrum Masters ignore test coverage, code branching, integration testing, and issue management. And the backlog in Agile often excludes users and product designers who are critical to the success of the product. Now, let's take a look at some quotes here. So the first is from a contributor on Reddit. I hate Scrum. There, I said it. Who else is joining me? Scrum seems to take away all the joy of being an engineer, working on tasks decided by someone else under a cadence that never stops. Now, later in the summary, I'm going to talk about the whole idea of a sprint and why sprints were traditionally something you did for a short period of time and then you rested and recovered from them, as you do in a track. But for some reason, Agile has kind of evolved into this monster where it's just constant sprinting, which is exhausting and demoralizing for engineers who are often just taking orders from a product owner or product manager. I don't actually want to self-organize. I want someone to get us organized so that I can code. I just want them to let me code the way that I want to. So this is a common complaint you see among developers. Now, we also see this article from Forbes talking about the end of Agile. So let's explore this in more depth. Now, when people look at leading companies in the tech space like Google, Amazon, and Netflix, and I worked in Silicon Valley for years, so I've seen Agile and some of the deficiencies of it. These successful companies, what they're doing is not similar to the Agile or DevOps that you or most people have experienced, perhaps working in a startup or a venture-backed startup. So now we have to sort of ask the question, well, Agile is there for a reason. Even though it has all these flaws, it was fixing something that was a mistake before. So what we had before Agile was something that was too slow and too ineffective for software especially. And what you did was you come up with big upfront requirement documents, and then eventually when the product releases, there's all sorts of problems with it. Now, one of the problems we're seeing today with Agile is, we've developed this system that's better for software, that's faster and doesn't require upfront requirement documents, but now we have emerging other problems. So we have things like Slack and Teams and open offices, which are very distracting for the developers that are working with Agile because a lot of them tend to be introverts. Now, the biggest deficiency, perhaps, with Agile is the lack of leadership or sort of discouraging companies from developing hierarchies. And really, we need hierarchies. Despite their fundamental flaws, and I'll talk about those tendencies later, they are the key to scaling. Now, when I worked for a small company out of college, I used to think, okay, the key to scaling is having operations, having documented operations. But as I gained more experience, I worked for 2 Google-affiliated startups. I worked for a Fortune 100 company. What I started to see was these companies didn't scale through operational procedural manuals or processes. They scaled through hierarchies, through having vice presidents, through having directors, through having people that were responsible for roles. And surprisingly, these really large companies actually didn't have any documented processes to a large extent. It was all resting on the hierarchy or the decision makers. Now, one of the problems here is that the Scrum Master in Agile lacks authority. And the Agile method, it tends to work well when you have a single team. So for example, in small startups that need to move quickly to survive, it makes total sense. But in larger companies, no. If an organization has good leadership, everything else will follow. The most impactful success factor is the leadership paradigm that the organization exhibits and incentivizes. And that's why CEOs, executives are always trying to get better at leadership because that's essential to scaling, to success. you don't want to just dictate to people what to do. What you want to do is leverage their expertise. So I want you to listen to me here on some tips for leadership that are coming from the book Agile 2. And there are 4 leadership styles. Directive, which is when you're issuing commands. Achievement oriented, which is where you're hands off, but you set objectives. So in my history, I preferred having bosses who were this. They were achievement oriented. They told me what the objective was, perhaps with the timeline, and then they left me alone to figure it out. And where I ran into conflict was one time my boss was replaced with another boss, and this person was much more hands-on, and I didn't really like that. It didn't jive with me. Another leadership style is participative. So being involved in group decision making, kind of a coming to a consensus, and then supportive, which is focusing on the well-being of the group members. Now, you really need to appreciate this because ultimately being successful with product development, with Agile, with DevOps is going to come from having the appropriate leadership, and hopefully you yourself can take some sort of leadership position. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that leaders emerge naturally. It's not necessarily a formal position that people are assigned. You throw any large group of people into a room, somebody or some number of people are going to emerge as leaders. One of their key functions is to resolve conflicts. So naturally, there are going to be disputes among people. Somebody needs to resolve that. And there's also soft leadership, which is mentoring, teaching, coordinating, facilitating, inspiring, and motivating. Leaders should empower and set directive. And one thing to keep in mind is that most people don't want to be order takers. They don't want to just be told, okay, do this. Now, this is especially true, I would say, in cases where you're dealing with very skilled professionals like advanced software engineers, marketers, finance people, etc. In my personal experience, it's been less the case in other industries. So I think that's sort of the bias in what he's saying. But yeah, definitely for someone like me, like I would never have wanted to be an order taker since the beginning of my career, and a lot of the people that you're going to be working with aren't either. Now, the types of leadership or where you're supplying leadership are going to be in a few different categories. So the first is product value. So this is setting the product vision for what it does. So this is like what a product manager would often do. And now there's also leadership with product development and implementation. And this is something that a lot of people in Agile miss, is that there's a technical aspect to leadership. There's a technical aspect to strategy that often gets overlooked when you just have a product manager assigning tasks for execution or implementation. So this development leadership is about creation and support. It's about technical design, or how the product works internally. Development workflow, how the team works with people and themselves. Technical practices, which is the technical workflow. The other type of leadership is for individuals, managing people. And the other thing to keep in mind is these functions, these various types of leadership are not roles or positions necessarily. They're more leadership that needs to happen regardless of what position or role fills it. Now, the author says, and there are numerous authors in this book, very experienced authors from very successful companies, but they say that designers tend to work as a group, whereas product development is mostly people sitting quietly at a keyboard doing programming. So something to keep in mind, and I don't think this is always true. In fact, I think often designers are introverts who just want to sit on their computer and work on their artwork. But the overall takeaway is you need a diversity of different working styles to accommodate different people, and I agree with that. Now, with tech, there's implementation, there's tech strategy, there's research, there's infrastructure, there's tooling support, there's technical product operations. It's much more complex than simply implementation, which is often how tech is treated, even in Silicon Valley. And the tooling is essentially the product that creates the product. Now, as products get more complex, what you see is that Agile falls apart. It starts to have all sorts of loose ends and inconsistencies. Maintainability becomes difficult. So really what you need is a technical architect who provides cohesion and consistency for complex products. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that there's often a trade-off between the usability and the jobs to be done of a product versus reliability, security, and compliance. And often what we see in government contracts, for example, they focus much more on reliability, security, and compliance, and then you lose out on the usability and how quickly jobs are done for users. When you have a lot at stake, which is often the case when you're working with large companies or scaled up products, it may be best to have collective decision making. Because often when you have management or individual leaders, they tend to underestimate risks, and the probability of a large catastrophic thing happening is more realistic when you're dealing with larger companies, more transactions, more happening. And you have to consider things like black swan events, which are unlikely events that are catastrophic. And what you may need to have is some sort of objective process to stop and fix the issue rather than just relying on a manager. Here are some of the things that a leader should do. And again, these are things that really are largely ignored by the Agile community. They should align and unite. They should be trusted. They should negotiate with powerful groups on behalf of their teams. They should know they don't have all the answers. They should know they cannot do everything. They should give authority and resources to the people beneath them and laterally as well. And they should assess people's abilities and trust them to do what they're capable of. Someone with power should never, ever openly agree with someone who has less power. Instead, ask questions. Why do you think that? What about this? Now, I've seen cases in Silicon Valley where some managers are really embarrassing their employees, criticizing them about personal things in public, and I just felt awful for that. So you have to be very careful as a leader talking and criticizing people in public. One general rule I followed is criticize in public, praise in public, or criticize in private, praise in public. Authoritarian leadership leads to decisions based on optics rather than outcomes. So I see that a lot of the time. A lot of the people in the corporate world are just doing whatever looks good, not necessarily what's going to achieve the best outcome for the company or for the product. Large teams generally don't function very well, and that's why we have hierarchies. You have to decompose companies into groups that are small enough to be effective and governable. Hierarchies tend to produce leaders that are more interested in climbing, so like climbing up the corporate ladder. It rewards optics, so looking good or taking credit. It rewards self-promoters. And despite all these tendencies of hierarchies, they're necessary. And the way that you mitigate these problems that come from hierarchies is you have to put the right kinds of leaders into different parts of the hierarchies so that you're not going to get too much tilting towards optics, self-promotion, et cetera, and you can still get real outcomes for the business. All right, some bad behaviors that we often see from leaders are taking over, forming an inner circle, not giving credit, not being transparent, overpowering others, and focusing on winning instead of finding the right answer. So like winning an argument instead of coming to the correct conclusion. In general, working with tech employees, they shouldn't be order takers. They often have the mindset with Agile that it's a relentless mill of implementing one story after another. The pressure never lets up. You're constantly sprinting. You burn out. And as I mentioned, the original sprints were meant to be followed by rest. So you've essentially created with Agile a modern assembly line with an endless backlog. Product owners often have little understanding of the technicals. They're just issuing orders without understanding the details. Agile sets up developers to take orders from business people, which is not an ideal situation because some of the best opportunities are going to come from the tech side, not necessarily from the business side. Agile teams talk to the product owner, but not actual users. It'd be nice if the people building the product actually knew how users were experiencing it. Now, the old way, basically what we had before Agile with Waterfall was you had a big plan with a bunch of milestones and all the tasks were shown in green. And it discouraged honesty because everybody wanted to show that their tasks were in green. They weren't in the red because they didn't want to be criticized and blamed for those mistakes. So what happens is at the end of the day when the products launch, there's all sorts of issues and everything falls behind schedule. So you really want an organization that values honesty. If the initiative is highly unique, then one cannot define all the tasks up front, which is what we were trying to do with Waterfall, come up with a big plan. But with unique products or new products, it's impossible to know beforehand. And that's one of the biggest mistakes I see, especially with startups or small entrepreneurs, is they'll spend a whole bunch of time creating this masterful product, release it to the market, and then nobody cares because you're not getting feedback from the real world on what works, what doesn't. A large portion of the work is learning and trying things. It's not just implementation. Product development is mostly a learning journey, not merely an implementation, which is how business often perceives development. Agile is driven largely by learning, which is one of the reasons Agile is great, is you get a lot of learning. So for example, when I release my courses, I'm able to see, here are the lectures, the videos that people really like, here are the ones they skip, here's what people are commenting on, here are the questions people are asking. I'm getting a lot of learning of what people want. I'm able to modify it. Okay, focus is important, and often we're not getting it in agile spaces. So groups that collaborate less may be better at problem solving. You might be surprised by that. And according to the authors, daily stand-ups are a complete waste of time. Because when people are in a stand-up meeting, they're really only concerned with what concerns them, what affects what they're doing. And stand-up meetings are surprisingly costly because if you think about it, there's the time before the meeting where a programmer, for example, is not going to start a task that requires a lot of concentration knowing that there's a meeting starting in 15 minutes. And then there's the meeting itself, which is a waste of time. And then there's the recovery and getting back into flow after the meeting. So stand-ups, get rid of them, waste of time. And instead, what you can do is manage by dashboards, by events, or by inquiries. You can use emails or direct interactions instead of these large meetings. And even for one-on-one meetings, don't create them just to share information. That's pretty much a waste. Another thing is Agile often doesn't place enough value on data. So data is strategic, and you have historical data, you have transactional data, you have production-like test data, and you have data protection. Make product developers get certified in secure product development. So that's a huge problem we're seeing in the tech space is insecure products. Security and reliability need to be designed into the product. It's not just something you fix or hack together at the end. And we see that older programmers are often better at thinking about this. They prefer static languages, which are more maintainable and robust, whereas youth tend to prefer Python and other languages that are difficult to maintain. Waterfall, the old-fashioned style of doing things, was better for repeatable work. So not introducing new products, but basically piecing together a new product that is essentially a replica of what we've had before. So here you would set the requirements, you would move to design, and then you would move to implementation. And then you would launch it and find out nobody wants it. So that's a huge problem that Agile has tried to fix, but Agile has created its own problems that we need to fix, and we'll dive into some of the solutions later on with DevOps and other methods. So methodologies such as Scrum could not work in large organizations unless the organization changed to accommodate it. Users should participate in product development, not just the product owner. Etsy, for example, measured every interaction to determine which features people liked and decided what to focus on. So I did the same thing in Silicon Valley. I look at Power BI. I would see, okay, who's using these features, who isn't. I saw, for example, large companies didn't use inventory management. Okay, let's change the value proposition for those large companies. Find out what users will really pay for, and that's really what they want. It's not what they say they will want when they do a survey. So it's what they need. It solves a pressing problem or resolves a burning desire. Focus on what they want to accomplish, and that's the thing that they're going to pay for. Okay, so here's some irony here. The irony of Agile. A haphazard internal design is also difficult to maintain and extend, which decreases one's business agility. So when you hack together a product using Agile methods, sort of tagging on features here and there, it becomes difficult to maintain and extend. So when you want to do that, when you want to be agile and quickly change the product, you can't because it was never designed to be very scalable. So to solve this, you need a technical vision, not just a business vision. So with Scrum, you have a product owner who maintains a prioritized list in increments, and the development happens in increments, which are generally 2-week sprints. Progress is assessed at the end. The list gets revised, the backlog, and you have short daily meetings for what they're doing in issues. And I mentioned that those should be abolished. You have test-driven development, which many believe is mandatory for Agile, but the authors are very critical of this. The best programmer doesn't add 10 times the value. He or she adds more, like 100 times. There is an example given in the book about a company that needed a new product that would normally take a team 6 months to produce, but the chief technology officer assigned a rock star programmer who was able to build it alone in just 2 months. They were able to beat the competitors to market and become industry leaders. So something to consider with your hiring practices or your assignments is, can we put somebody who's highly productive on this instead of an entire team? And perhaps it's worth paying a lot more to get the best programmer rather than just an adequate programmer. Now, we can compare Agile to something like construction, where they use the waterfall method that uses a detailed upfront plan for a procedural process. But software development is fundamentally different because it's a creative process, it's a learning process. It's not just an execution process based on a plan. And that's a problem I ran into over 10 years ago when I was working on web design projects. I didn't know at the time, but I was basically trying to follow a waterfall process of here's the design, here's the copywriting. Okay, we'll hand it off to the programmer will develop, and then we'd start to run into issues. So it would have been better to do something that had more agility built into the process and learning built into it. Agile often leaves unfinished loose ends, disorganization that accumulates. And this is really what you're going to see as your company starts to grow. It's difficult for others to understand. So like a new programmer comes on the project, doesn't know how to add things, modify things. So then here's what you see. You start to fail with increasing frequency, and the software or the product falls apart. Do not fill your backlog such that it prevents teams from doing their own preventative maintenance to deter this from happening. Each line of code interconnects in a complicated non-hierarchical way that cannot be visualized. It is impossible to divide product development in separate phases. Product design is iterative. Can't decide on requirements until you have an early product version working. So this is the idea of a minimum viable product, an MVP, where you keep adding to it and improving it over time. Collaboration for complex issues requires ongoing communication using various types, so writing, discussing, diagramming, thinking, and often that means deep thinking in order to process complex problems. Agile's insistence on face-to-face meetings, not good for a lot of people, especially programmers who tend to be introverted. Open offices are stressful for introverts, and Slack disrupts concentration. Foster a diversity of communication and diversity of working style. Leaders who tend to emerge from remote work are the organizers rather than the ones with the most personality. Introverts benefit most from remote work. Being in an open office might favor those who are extroverted and socially aggressive. Product focus. DevOps is a set of ideas pertaining to delivering software rapidly at scale. Focus on the product, not the team, which is often what we see in Agile. Focus on the team. Vision guides people in decisions. Vision guides. That's something, so as people make decisions, they can reference the vision for the product as a rule or a thing to reference when they're making those decisions. Feature prioritization, you can use something like weighted shortest job first, WSJF. It's essentially going after the low-hanging fruit. But one thing that this is missing is it doesn't account for risk, both technical risk and business risk. So you need to adjust for that. Product should be self-measuring. You should have a lot of feedback loops for the infrastructure, the product engineering, the business usage, and outcomes. Measuring speed of development is useless without also measuring quality. So the fact that you can develop things quickly doesn't mean it's any good or useful for the end users or customers. The time to develop a new feature is mostly consumed by the time required to test it. Upward of half a programmer's time is spent in the state of it should work, but it doesn't. Why not? So that's something you need to factor in when you're creating the processes or the plans for your products, is that most of the time is actually just testing. And that's one of the problems with Agile is you create a lot of problems when you just sort of quickly add in these features. And I've noticed this because I'm currently a beta tester for Bang& Olufsen, the luxury audio company, and they're just constantly doing these tests with the software and things going wrong, and it's just it's a very time-consuming process. So later we're going to talk about how we can use continuous flow to release products that have been fully tested with regard to their integration with the entire product. So you can test in isolation a new product feature, or you can test it in the whole product, so that fully contextual. So one of the rules in Agile 2 is integrate early and often. Generally, one should not measure or score people on how they do things. The outcome should be what matters in most cases. And product design is arguably more important than Agile itself. And we can see that with Apple. Apple is one of the only design-first companies or design-led companies. It's really about creating this well-designed product. And often there's a trade-off there. The more designed the product is, the less you can be experimental with Agile methods, but it's been very successful in Apple's case. Another thing to keep in mind is with Agile, often you're starting with a business idea with the product owner, and then there's the question of can we build it or how do we build it? But often what happens in reality is there's a new technology that comes out, and the question is how do we leverage it? So for example, with Amazon was successful not because they said, oh, this is our target customer and what our target customer wanted. Instead, they looked at a new technology, which was the internet and the explosion of the internet, and said, okay, what is the biggest opportunity there? That was the starting point, not a customer need. And today we see that with AI, generative AI. There's this explosion in capabilities. So the question is not, what's a customer problem, and then AI happens to be a solution. It's we have this revolutionary technology. How do we leverage that? How do we employ that? So somehow with Agile, the product owner has supplanted the customer, and the customer often only sees the product at release. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. There are companies that do a lot of beta testing, etc. I've definitely seen that, but perhaps not enough customer involvement early on and direct connections with the product developers or the engineers. So one of the problems is that surveys, when we survey customers, they're not very reliable because surveys require too little effort, and there's a lot of effort required to learn and use a new product, and often that's where things fall apart. They might say, oh yeah, we love it, we'd pay for it, and then they get to it and then they just abandon it. And you see that a lot in SaaS. 1 million people sign up for a free trial, and then 5% of them actually end up using it or even coming back to use it a second time, logging in a second time. You can validate ideas through small contained experiments. You can test with early adopters. So I'm an early adopter for Bang & Olufsen, but I'm not representative of a typical headphone speaker purchaser. I'm somebody that's probably going to buy the product as soon as it comes out. I'm checking their website daily. I'm not representative. So to get representative users, what you do is you have to pay them. You have to compensate them for their time, essentially, or provide some sort of incentive. Obtain feedback from the market and stakeholder continuously. So I'm doing that all the time with my digital products, for example, my courses. I always see what lectures are bookmarked, what's skipped, what people are asking me about, what my reviews are saying, and that's one of the reasons I'm such a successful online course creator. But this Agile approach, it also comes with problems where my courses can end up being a bit messy because things are rearranged haphazardly. It wasn't based on a design. It was based on empirical evidence collection. So there's a trade-off there, and we're going to try to reconcile that later in this video. So requirements-based approach is good for mechanics when you're dealing with something that isn't involving humans, and that's kind of what we see in Waterfall. But it's generally not good for anything used directly by humans. So user interfaces, for example, business to consumer SaaS, or SaaS that's meant to be used by somebody that's not a technical expert. Amazon uses a method called working backwards, where what they do is before they make a feature or a product, they write a press release for it, and then that forces them to think about whether it's compelling. And it also helps them avoid scope creep, because if it's not able to make it into the press release, then it's not perhaps worthy of making. You want to collect data on reliability, feature usage, and performance. For example, I found looking at Power BI data that a lot of large mid-sized companies were not using inventory features, but they were using transactional features with accounting. Okay, now we know where we should invest more of our technical resources. Too many products today are insecure or untrustworthy. So I'm having a lot of unreliability issues, for example, with Bluetooth connectivity. Ideas frequently originate from engineering because technology presents opportunities that businesses may not be aware of, and that's one of the problems with Agile. Often it's just the product owner dictating what gets done. Product development is mostly a learning journey, not merely an implementation. Now, we're going to talk about some tracks. So often with Agile, you're dealing with just one track, but we have dual track methods that can speed things up and work in parallel. So one example of this, design operates in its own activity, perhaps with collaboration directly with users, and then design intersects on a regular basis with development. The backlog is not the totality of work. You also allow free time to brainstorm and experiment. An alternative would be design comes up with designs and regularly feeds those to the technical team. This would be appropriate for mundane tasks, but not with more complex things or things that are critical to what the user is going to want. Agile is mostly single track. You have stories that are fed to the development team. You have less holistic designs because it's based on individual stories, not a vision for the holistic design of the product. Meetings. Pressing need for discussing a complicated issue would be a good case for a meeting. Another good case is collective decision making that requires real-time collaboration or creativity. Meetings are also useful just to build relationship or camaraderie, but a lot of meetings are just a complete waste of time. For example, you shouldn't have them for just sharing information. The Scrum framework endorses empiricism or the experiment approach, which is as I mentioned, how I know how to improve my products is based on real data on what people are using. But that's not always what's best because often you get messy products when you design things that way. Apple, for example, relies more on having a vision, having a beautiful product that's easy to use. So I also want to highlight an example here where I see AI having the most use is when it's able to get immediate feedback from the market. And because of that, it's able to optimize and learn and get better. But where AI is not going to be very good is things that you can't experiment with, where you can't use an empirical approach. So for example, what is the impact on brand awareness 5 years from now? What is the customer lifetime value of doing this today? And we see that a lot of successful products or brands are built over long periods of time. It's not just this immediate, how do we get feedback? So that's some of the limitations of AI, and it's also some of the limitations of Agile. For that, you really need vision, design. Risk management. Something you need to think about is that if we look at the animal kingdom, some animals need speed to survive, which is what we see with Agile, right? We want to move quickly. Because we need to get to market faster than our bigger competitors, and that's part of our competitive edge. But as you get bigger, as you become a different type of animal, that's not necessarily the key to success. The key to success then is how do we mitigate risk? How do we prevent this from falling apart? How do we prevent black swan events? How do we prevent us from getting sued and having insecure privacy, etc.? So DevOps attempts to revive the spirit of thinking about the whole product and all the steps needed to deliver it to actual users. And when we look at product initiatives, they should have two types of metrics. There's leading metrics, which are behavioral, and there are trailing metrics, which are outcomes. And we can track these metrics at each level. So at the level of the product business, at the level of product operation, and at the level of the product platform operation. Examples of trailing metrics would be conversion rate to paid from prospects, frequency of feature use, reliability and usability scores from users. Leading metrics would be, for example, the number of beta users, the amount of promotion that was done. And I've seen this a lot in the marketing world where there's way too much emphasis placed on trailing metrics. So things like, did we get an immediate sale? Did we get an immediate conversion? But not enough emphasis on things that are necessary inputs today to produce results in the future, especially in business to business. If you're building software for enterprise, for example, it might be 12 to 18 months from when a lead is generated to when a sale happens, especially with strategic business-to-business purchases. So there, you really can't rely on trailing indicators. You have to rely on leading metrics, which is more of the activity that you put into what you're doing rather than the outcomes that you get at the end. One thing to help speed things up, automate integration tests, create a culture of honesty so that you are able to identify things early. When you do writing, to make things clear, avoid redundancy, use the active voice, use few pronouns, and separate paragraphs for each new idea. With continuous delivery, development never stops. You have automated tests. When a feature is completed, a complete new product version is passed to testing. So there we can see how this feature affects the totality of the product rather than just that feature in isolation, which is where so much time is eaten up, is trying to resolve all the conflicts, all the bugs, et cetera, that happen from introducing new products or new features. And then you introduce one new feature, creates 5 new bugs. You fix that bug, creates another bug, et cetera. We can fix that with continuous delivery. So, continuous stream of product versions released to users. Product development and tested feature is tested feature by feature versus long development with a long test phase, which is often what we see in companies that are not as modern with their approaches. In software, we have product versions produced many times per day. In hardware, you're going to have a lower cadence, maybe a few days or a few weeks, different product features being released. Just because a product version passes all its development tests does not mean that the product is what people actually want. So you have to put it in the hands of users. One of the easiest ways to do that is with prototypes, which is what we see in the book Sprint, written by people that work with Google Ventures and did over 100 sprints. Really, the emphasis of that book is on prototypes, using sprints to test prototypes rather than the products themselves. And we can also get insights from customer service, from account managers, et cetera. We don't necessarily always need to go directly to the end users or the end buyers. Code coverage metrics, not useful for today's complex products. You need a balance between design and experimentation. And this is a key issue in product development where you have some trade-off there. You have to foster collaboration between teams through shared objectives so they're aligned and not fighting against each other. You have 2 types of dependencies, technical and logical. A conceptual design should include just 3 things: the set of product decisions, the taxonomy, like the language, and the rationale for each decision. Don't fully commit capacity to deal with emerging issues. Continuous integration and continuous testing. Now, some details on DevOps. Integrate product development with product operations. Have rapid development at scale while managing risk in real time. Should have frequent deployments. So, for example, Amazon does over 1,000 deployments per hour. Should have the ability to experiment. You should have shorter product feature lead time, shorter time to recover from problems. Product owners tend to demand more features instead of focusing on maintainability. But with DevOps, we should be focusing more on maintainability. We have lean metrics for DevOps, which are lead time, cycle time, mean time to recover, mean time to repair, defect rate, test coverage, and quality. We have leading metrics like test frequency, for example, integration tests, and merge frequency. Agile 2 at scale. So, for example, Spotify, very large product, but it has a lot of inconsistency of features across platforms because the product basically evolved over time. It wasn't designed over time. So we have Android, iOS, PC, and web player all having different variations of features. So what we see is products are getting more complex. And you run into all sorts of issues at scale. For example, who creates the product vision? You need to settle harmonization among teams. You have architectural abstractions that are needed to reduce dependencies. Who talks to designers and users? Do some teams need to operate differently, etc.? Now, some organizations place big bets on products or features. So, for example, FedEx had a huge investment in overnight delivery, but most companies do small bets, and sometimes those pay off, sometimes they don't. For example, Apple Watch, successful, but it was a small bet. If Apple Watch had failed, it wouldn't have destroyed Apple as a company. And then we have a failure, which was the butterfly keyboard, and it's fine. They pivoted, they went back to something more like what they had before with the keyboard. But the key thing is that when you place these small bets, you need to think about whether those products, those features fit into the overall strategy, and they're not just random things tacked on to create a Frankenstein business or Frankenstein product. Assembly lines cannot make unique products, and sometimes that's what we see with backlogs as they essentially become like assembly lines. SpaceX, for example, has no delivery dates or scheduled demos. Work is based on flow, not cadence, and you have a continuous delivery system. You want to aggressively remove bottlenecks to ensure this continuous delivery. You want to build many prototypes and test them, so that helps mitigate your risk. And some things that management needs to consider, given that they often don't have the technical expertise, is designing software-centric products. So even with hardware today, it's really difficult to separate hardware from software because so many of the internal parts are driven by software. For example, my smart speaker, my headphones, all of these are connected through an application, through a software application. So these are not pure hardware. And we need to think about managing software products at scale. We need to think about dynamic environments, continuous flow of builds, and digital testing methods that are modern. So, for example, functional integration testing versus field integration testing. So, releasing something into the field, finding out there's a million bugs, trying to repair all of that is pretty messy, inefficient process. So, we have to think better about what modern testing methods are available. And we also need to make sure the platform itself is highly stable. So, for example, the C software engineers are going to be the ones who are coding directly into the hardware, and we need to make sure what they're building as a platform is highly stable. And we need to think about the platform versus components, where components don't necessarily need to be as rigid or strict as what we're doing in the platform. And lastly, here are some tips for HR. The best people to hire generally come from boutique firms. Annual reviews are useless. Instead, what you want to focus on is giving people immediate contextual feedback, because you want to give continuous improvement for your employees, and you want to give very specific feedback, because if you don't give specific feedback, people have a very hard time understanding or visualizing the feedback that you're giving them.